There's Andrew, Kylie, Caesar, and Kayla in person. Okay. So I'm going to sit here. I'm going to take my mask off. Kayla's far enough away from me. So we're going to finish chapter 12, the end of finish the novel. And there's about 10 pages left. We should be able to do that. And you have a little bit of time. You can finish up the set of questions. And any, like, your character analysis over this 5 or 6 different characters, that's going to be due Monday. I think I need to change that due date. Why do I keep doing that? Okay, Lord of the Flies. Oh, darn it. Hey, Jacob's there too. We got 5 in class. 1 in person, 4 online. There should be a lot more of you. Sorry, guys. So we're coming to the end of the novel. I'm going to talk about it as I scroll through to the end, to chapter 12. So let's talk about where they've come at this point. Here, especially Ralph. Let's think about the contrast. And the author is very clever in this. How did Ralph act at the very beginning of the novel at being stranded on what he considered a paradise of an island without any adults? What was his response at that point? How did he act? Does anybody remember? You need to remember back that far, guys.
He was happy.
Oh yeah, he was happy.
He was happy, and he thought that living on the island would be
oh my gosh. Yeah, this is going to be fun. But then he had to take on the responsibility of chief. And partway through the novel, maybe early on, there was a chapter early on where Ralph says he was realizing that this wasn't fun. This was work, their survival. And this was after a few months. We don't know how many months they've been on this island. We know it's long enough that his hair is in his eyes. So how long does it take? If you have short hair, how long does it take for your hair to get down past your eyes? Oh no, it's going to be longer than
3 months.
at least 3 or 4 months for your bangs to get that long. Because your hair doesn't grow that fast. But there they all are. In fact, the Savage Boys when Ralph and Piggy, when they went to see them, he realized, well, they already pulled their hair back like girls, and he wished he had because he could see better that way. So I'm picturing these Savage Boys with man buns. Can you see them? Probably not big man buns, but, you know, pulling their hair back. But they're filthy. They've lost all sense of civilization. Ralph, who was so thinking, oh, what an adventure, joyous enough to stand on his head not once but several times in joy to express how he was feeling, is now being hunted. He's running for his life, guys. Running for his life. Simon's dead at the hands of the boys. Piggy is dead, mainly at the hand of Roger, but, you know, at the encouragement of the others. And now Sam and Eric have told Ralph that Jack and Roger want him dead. And that gruesome idea that they whispered, because he's like, I'm going to be okay, aren't I? And one of the twins says, Roger made carved a stick with points at both ends. And Ralph's like, what do you mean? What for? He doesn't get it yet. He does, somewhere in the back of his head. He probably realizes it, but that stick that's pointed at both ends is for when they kill him, they're then going to cut his head off and stick it on the pole like they did the pig. Now, I know in our, you look back in history, we didn't do that here in the United States. Things were a little more civilized at some point. But the medieval period and before that, the crusades, the Christian crusades and things like that, they would put their enemies' heads on pikes, and you would see them just, there they were, these rotting human heads. And that's what they've got planned for Ralph. And it's just, I think that's one of the most gruesome thoughts of all, is that they would do that, that's what their plan was. Gives me the willies, guys. Gives me chills to think that way. All right, I'm almost to where we had read. Sorry. It all started over. And I have not been able to find, pulling this up anywhere on my tablet, that it lets me just jump ahead quickly. I have to scroll through the entire thing. So we're almost there. I think I was on page 142, something like that. So I'm almost there. 152? Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, because I had 10 pages left. That's right. 152. Okay. Thanks, Caesar. Yeah, chapter 12 started at like 142, 143. So, yeah, we'd gotten at least halfway through it. Okay, almost there. 151. Okay, so they were tossing more rocks down because they knew where he was hiding. Remember, he was hiding in the thicket, and they couldn't really get through very well without him being able to defend himself. And so either Sam or Eric gave away his location, because what we understand, because they're screaming and so forth, that they were basically torturing them. And Sam and Eric had both said that Roger is just a nightmare, and they didn't want to make him mad, and they gave in to the torture, whatever they did to them, that gave away that Ralph had told them where he was going to hide. And so they know, and they're putting down rocks. I'm going to go ahead and read at the top of 152. I think I'd already read that, but someone was moaning outside, and a babble of voices rose. A fierce argument was going on, and the wounded savage kept groaning. Then, when there was silence, a single voice spoke, and Ralph decided that it was not Jack's. "See, I told you, he's dangerous." So, they're painting Ralph. All Ralph, like he told the twins, all Ralph wanted was for them to, oh, yeah, I am recording. Okay. All Ralph wanted was to make sure they had a signal fire going. And yet he's now being hunted to kill. And part of them, part of the persuasion with the other boys who may have been a little bit more sensible, he's dangerous, so we have to get rid of him. And again, this goes to this mob mentality. And think about how Hitler convinced people to follow him and do these atrocities. Well, it's dangerous. That's the cleverness and the frightening thing about certain people in our history that have led others to do the wrong thing. The wounded savage moaned again. What else? What next? Ralph fastened his hands around the chewed spear, and his hair fell. Someone was muttering only a few yards away toward the castle rock. He heard a savage say, "No," in a shocked voice, and then there was suppressed laughter. He squatted back on his heels and showed his teeth at the wall of branches. He raised his spear, snarled a little, and waited. Once more, the invisible group sniggered. He heard a curious trickling sound, and then a louder crepitation as if someone were unwrapping great sheets of cellophane. Think about how that would sound. Unwrapping great sheets of cellophane. It's actually the crackling of a fire. A stick snapped, and he stifled a cough. Smoke was seeping through the branches in white and yellow wisps. The patch of blue sky overhead turned to the color of a storm cloud, and then the smoke billowed round him. Someone laughed excitedly, and a voice shouted, "Smoke!" He wormed his way through the thicket toward the forest, keeping as far as possible beneath the smoke. Presently, he saw open space and the green leaves of the edge of the thicket. A smallish savage was standing between him and the rest of the forest, a savage striped red and white and carrying a spear. He was coughing and smearing the paint about his eyes with the black back of his hand as he tried to see through the increasing smoke. Ralph launched himself like a cat, stabbed, snarling with the spear, and the savage doubled up. There was a shout from beyond the thicket, and then Ralph was running with the swiftness of fear through the undergrowth. He came to a pig run, followed it for perhaps 100 yards, and then swerved off. Behind him, the ululation swept across the island once more, and a single voice shouted 3 times. He guessed that was the signal to advance and sped away again till his chest was like fire. Then he flung himself down under a bush and waited for a moment till his breathing steadied. He passed his tongue tentatively over his teeth and lips and heard far off the ululation of the pursuers. So they burn it. They're trying to burn him out. So they've set fire to where he was hiding, to this thicket, and they're trying to smoke him out so they can get him. And so far, he's been able to outwit them a little bit, but now, he's out of breath and he has to stop and rest for a minute so he can keep going. There were many things he could do. He could climb a tree, but that was putting all his eggs in one basket. If he were detected, they had nothing more difficult to do than wait. If only one had time to think. Another double cry at the same distance gave him a clue to their plan. Any savage balked in the forest would utter the double shout and hold up the line till he was free again. That way, they might hope to keep the cordon unbroken right across the island. Ralph thought of the boar that had broken through them with such ease. If necessary, when the chase came too close, he could charge the cordon while it was still thin, burst through and run back. But run back where? The cordon would turn and sweep again. Sooner or later, he would have to sleep or eat, and then he would awaken with hands clawing at him, and the hunt would become a running down. What was to be done then? The tree? Burst the line like a boar? Either way, the choice was terrible. A single cry quickened his heartbeat, and leaping up, he dashed away toward the ocean side and the thick jungle till he was hung up among creepers. He stayed there for a moment with his calves quivering. If only one could have quiet, a long pause, a time to think. And there again, shrill and inevitable, was the ululation sweeping across the island. At that sound, he shied like a horse among the creepers and ran once more till he was panting. He flung himself down by some ferns. The tree or the charge? He mastered his breathing for a moment, wiped his mouth, and told himself to be calm. Sam and Eric were somewhere in that line and hating it. Or were they? And supposing instead of them he met the chief or Roger, who carried death in his hands. Ralph pushed back his tangled hair and wiped the sweat out of his best eye. He spoke aloud. Think. What was the sensible thing to do? There was no piggy to talk sense. There was no solemn assembly for debate, nor dignity of the conch. Think. Most, he was beginning to dread the curtain that might waver in his brain, blacking out the sense of danger, making a simpleton of him. A third idea would be to hide so well that the advancing line would pass without discovering him. He jerked his head off the ground and listened. There was another noise to attend to now, a deep grumbling noise, as though the forest itself were angry with him, a somber noise across which the ululations were scribbled excruciatingly as on slate. Guys, the ululations that he's talking about, they're going like, like that, but really loud, okay? I don't know if you all realized that. That's what the noise they were making. He knew he had heard it before somewhere, but had no time to remember. Break the line, a tree, hide, and let them pass. These are his three choices. Break the line, hide, a tree. Okay. A nearer cry stood him on his feet, and immediately he was away again, running fast among thorns and brambles. Suddenly he blundered into the open, found himself again in that open space, and there was the fathom-wide grin of the skull, no longer ridiculing a deep blue patch of sky, but jeering up into a blanket of smoke. Then Ralph was running beneath trees with the grumble of the forest explained. They had smoked him out and set the island on fire. So now they've set the entire forest on fire. Hide was better than a tree because you had a chance of breaking the line if you were discovered. Hide then. He wondered if a pig would agree, and grimaced at nothing. Find the deepest thicket, the darkest hole in the island, and creep in. Now, as he ran, he peered about him. Bars and splashes of sunlight flitted over him, and sweat made glistening streaks on his dirty body. The cries were far now, and faint. At last he found what seemed to him the right place, though the decision was desperate. Here, bushes and a wild tangle of creeper made a mat that kept out all the light of the sun. Beneath it was a space, perhaps a foot high, though it was pierced everywhere by parallel and rising stems. If you wormed into the middle of that, you would be 5 yards from the edge and hidden, unless the savage chose to lie down and look for you. And even then, you would be in darkness. So he's got this maybe somewhat like what Simon would hide in the forest. Okay. And if the worst happened and he saw you, then you had a chance to burst out at him, fling the whole line out of step, and double back. Cautiously, his stick trailing behind him, Ralph wormed between the rising stems. When he reached the middle of the mat, he lay and listened. The fire was a big one, and the drum roll that he had thought was left so far behind was nearer. Couldn't a fire outrun a galloping horse? He could see the sun-splashed ground over an area of perhaps 50 yards from where he lay. And as he watched, the sunlight in every patch blinked at him. This was so like the curtain that flapped in his brain that for a moment he thought the blinking was inside him. But then the patches blinked more rapidly, dulled, and went out, so that he saw that a great heaviness of smoke lay between the island and the sun. Now, guys, if they've set fire to the entire island, what else are they risking that the boys, these savage boys, haven't thought of? Any thoughts? If he set fire to the entire, if they set fire to the entire island, what are they also burning up and destroying? Yeah, food, pigs, and fruits. Yes, exactly. They are risking destroying their entire food source, whether it's the fruit trees or the pigs. And remember, they've been killing the sows too. So, you know, unless they've kept count of the baby pigs and whether how, you know, the ratio of males to females to keep that food supply going, if they're going to be on that island long term, they're destroying their own food sources and kind of destroying their own lives in a way, just to smoke out Ralph so they can kill him, because they are not thinking like long term, like civilized human beings. Okay. If anyone peered under the bushes and chanced to glimpse human flesh, it might be Sam and Eric, who would pretend not to see anything, to see and say nothing. He laid his cheek against the chocolate-colored earth, licked his dry lips, and closed his eyes. Under the thicket, the earth was vibrating very slightly, or perhaps there was a sound beneath the obvious thunder of the fire and scribbled ululations that was too low to hear. Someone cried out. Ralph jerked his cheek off the earth and looked into the dulled light. They must be near that now, he thought, and his chest began to thump. Hide, break the line, climb a tree. Which was the best after all? The trouble was, you only had one chance. Now the fire was nearer. Those volleying shots were great limbs, trunks even, bursting. The fools, the fools! The fire must be almost at the fruit trees. What would they eat tomorrow? Again, like we said, Ralph stirred restlessly in his narrow bed. One chance, nothing. What could they do? Beat him? So what? Kill him? A stick sharpened at both ends. The cries, suddenly nearer, jerked him up. He could see a striped savage moving hastily out of a green tangle and coming toward the mat where he hid, a savage who carried a spear. Ralph gripped his fingers into the earth. Be ready now, in case. Ralph fumbled to hold his spear so that it was point foremost, and now he saw that the stick was sharpened at both ends. The savage. So Ralph is now realizing what that meant. Because remember, Ralph has the stick that the Lord of the Flies, the sow's head, was on. The savage stopped 15 yards away and uttered his cry. Perhaps he can hear my heart over the noises of the fire. Don't scream. Get ready. The savage moved forward so that you could only see him from the waist down. That was the butt of his spear. Now you could see him from the knee down. Don't scream. A herd of pigs came squealing out of the greenery behind the savage and rushed away into the forest. Birds were screaming, mice shrieking, and a little hopping thing came under the mat and cowered. 5 yards away, the savage stopped, standing right by the thicket, and cried out. Ralph drew his feet up and crouched. The stake was in his hands, the stake sharpened at both ends, the stake that vibrated so wildly that grew strong, long, short, light, heavy, light again. The ululation spread from shore to shore. The savage knelt down by the edge of the thicket, and there were lights flickering in the forest behind him. You could see a knee disturb the mold, now the other. 2 hands, a spear, a face. The savage peered into the obscurity beneath the thicket. You could tell that he saw light on this side and on that, but not in the middle there. In the middle was a blob of dark, and the savage wrinkled up his face, trying to decipher the darkness. The seconds lengthened. Ralph was looking straight into the savage's eyes. Don't scream. You'll get back. Now he's seen you. He's making sure. A stick sharpened. Ralph screamed, a scream of fright and anger and desperation. His legs straightened. The screams became continuous and foaming. He shot forward, burst the thicket, was in the open, screaming, snarling, bloody. He swung the stake, and the savage tumbled over. But there were others coming toward him, crying out. He swerved as a spear flew past, and then was silent, running. All at once, the lights flickering ahead of him merged together. The roar of the forest rose to thunder, and a tall bush directly in his path burst into a great fan-shaped flame. He swung to the right, running desperately fast with the heat beating on his left side and the fire racing forward like a tide. The ululation rose behind him and spread along. A series of short, sharp cries, the sighting call. A brown figure showed up at his right and fell away. They were all running, all crying out madly. He could hear them crashing in the undergrowth, and on the left was the hot, bright thunder of the fire. He forgot his wounds, his hunger and thirst, and became fear. Hopeless fear on flying feet, rushing through the forest toward the open beach. Spots jumped before his eyes and turned into red circles that expanded quickly till they passed out of sight. Below him, someone's legs were getting tired, and the desperate ululation advanced like a jagged fringe of menace and was almost overhead. He stumbled over a root, and the cry that pursued him rose even higher. He saw a shelter burst into flames, and the fire flapped at his right shoulder, and there was the glitter of water. Then he was down, rolling over and over in the warm sand, crouching with arm to ward off, trying to cry for mercy. He staggered to his feet, tensed for more terrors, and looked up at a huge peaked cap. It was a white-topped cap, and above the green shade of the peak was a crown, an anchor, gold foliage. He saw white drill, epaulets, a revolver, a row of gilt buttons down the front of a uniform. A naval officer stood on the sand, looking down at Ralph in wary astonishment. On the beach behind him was a cutter, her bows hauled up and held by 2 ratings. In the stern sheets, another rating held a submachine gun. The ululation faltered and died away. The officer looked at Ralph doubtfully for a moment, then took his hand away from the butt of the revolver. "Hello?" Squirming a little, conscious of his filthy appearance, Ralph answered shyly, "Hello." The officer nodded as if a question had been answered. "Are there any adults, any grown-ups with you?" Dumbly, Ralph shook his head. He turned a half pace on the sand. A semicircle of little boys, their bodies streaked with colored clay, sharp sticks in their hands, were standing on the beach, making no noise at all. "Fun and games," said the officer. The fire reached the coconut palms by the beach and swallowed them noisily. A flame, seemingly detached, swung like an acrobat and licked up the palm heads on the platform. The sky was black. The officer grinned cheerfully at Ralph. "We saw your smoke. What have you been doing? Having a war or something?" Ralph nodded. The officer inspected the little scarecrow in front of him. The kid needed a bath, a haircut, a nose wipe, and a good deal of ointment. "Nobody killed, I hope. Any dead bodies?" "Only 2, and they've gone." The officer leaned down and looked closely at Ralph. "2? Killed?" Ralph nodded again. Behind him, the whole island was shuddering with flame. The officer knew, as a rule, when people were telling the truth. He whistled softly. Other boys were appearing now, tiny tots, some of them, brown with the distended bellies of small savages. One of them came close to the officer and looked up. I'm... But there was no more to come. Percival Wemyss Madison sought in his head for an incantation that had faded clean away. The officer turned back to Ralph. "We'll take you off. How many of you are there?" Ralph shook his head. The officer looked past him to the group of painted boys. "Who's boss here?" "I am," said Ralph loudly. A little boy who wore the remains of an extraordinary black cap on his red hair and who carried the remains of a pair of spectacles at his waist started forward, then changed his mind and stood still. "We saw your smoke, and you don't know how many of you there are?" "No, sir." "I should have thought," said the officer as he visualized the search before him, "I should have thought that a pack of British boys, you're all British, aren't you, would have been able to put up a better show than that. I mean..." "It was like that at first," said Ralph, "before things..." He stopped. "We were together then." The officer nodded helpfully. "I know, jolly good show, like the Coral Island." Ralph looked at him dumbly. For a moment, he had a fleeting picture of the strange glamour that had once invested the beaches. But the island was scorched up like dead wood. Simon was dead, and Jack had... The tears began to flow, and sobs shook him. He gave himself up to them now for the first time on the island. Great shuddering spasms of grief, that seemed to wrench his whole body. His voice rose under the black smoke before the burning wreckage of the island, and infected by that emotion, the other little boys began to shake and sob too. And in the middle of them, with filthy body, matted hair, and unwiped nose, Ralph wept for the end of innocence, the darkness of man's heart, and the fall through the air of the true wise friend called Piggy. The officer, surrounded by these noises, was moved and a little embarrassed. He turned away to give them time to pull themselves together and waited, allowing his eyes to rest on the trim cruiser in the distance. And that is the end of the novel. So, they are rescued. However, what have they lost besides Piggy and Simon? Hopefully Jack and Roger go to jail. That would be nice, but that probably didn't happen. You noticed, yeah, they lost their, their humanity. Ralph says innocence. I like this last line. Ralph wept for the end of innocence, the darkness of man's heart, and the fall through the air of the true wise friend called Piggy. Realizing that Piggy was someone he could count on, even though he may have found him annoying, especially at the beginning, and Piggy wasn't the popular one, and the other kids would pick on him. But Piggy was the true wise friend. No, those boys probably will not go to jail.
Didn't we start watching the video clip?
We did, but there's not much. We might next week. Yeah. We only have 2 days next week. As far as I know, we're going to be back. Yeah. Unless something happens over the weekend, I think we're going to be back. But yeah, they've lost Ralph, especially, someone like Roger and like Jack. I'm not sure the way they're made, they'll probably just push down any kind of remorse or guilt they might feel. Well, no, it was on the island. They put themselves in denial. Roger doesn't sound like he's going to grow up to be a very nice person anyway, and may end up in prison at some point for something he does later as an adult. Ralph, we don't know if Ralph ever says, well, this is what happened, because remember, Ralph was caught up in the death of Simon. So they will probably never tell the adults. Maybe at some point they'll get psychological counseling, but that wasn't something that was very common back then. But yeah, what are some ironic things about the ending of the story? Can you think of any irony here? Any ironic situations or anything like that? Okay, well, let me give you one bit of irony. What was it that Ralph was telling them all along they needed to have? And the reason why they went to get Piggy's glasses back, because they needed smoke, a fire. They needed a rescue fire or a signal fire. So if any ships went nearby, they could be rescued. Anybody see where I'm going here? The other boys who were just interested in hunting, in their attempt to capture Ralph and burn him out, ironically create the giant fire that does get them rescued. So there's irony for you right there. And once again, when Ralph declares himself leader, Jack starts to say something and then he doesn't. Lets it go. But yeah, the irony here is that the forest fire they started that was destroying the whole island and destroying all of their food sources, ironically, in the end, is what leads to them being rescued. That was not their intent. They weren't thinking about anything in the future. They just wanted to, let's smoke out Ralph. We'll set fire to the forest. You can't hide in there. They're not thinking long term. But there they go. They cause this huge fire. and here comes the ship. There's also some irony here in the adult, and there's a purpose to this. Well, first the officer says, I should have thought that, you're British, a pack of British boys, you're all British, aren't you? Would have been able to put up a better show than that. I mean, saying, well, why didn't you boys hold it together better? And then he mentions jolly good show, makes a reference to Coral Island, an adventure, okay, like the boys had originally thought, like Ralph had originally thought, this is an adventure. And it says, Ralph looked at him dumbly. For a moment, he had a fleeting picture of the strange glamour that had once invested the beaches. And so what it's doing there, what the author is doing for us, is showing us that, the adults aren't that different than the boys, than the children. It's he's making that a very subtle suggestion that it is possible, it might have taken longer, but it is possible that that adults in the same situation might have come to the same ending. That's what he's suggesting with that. And Ralph, I think, has realized that too. Well, his innocence is gone. And the darkness of humanity, and realizing the adults aren't all that different. Guys, I have to tell you a little story that goes along with that. When I first started teaching many years ago, I had seniors, so 17, 18-year-old kids in my classes. And my mother was still teaching at the time. She taught first grade. Not here, but in another school system near where I grew up. And I remember I had called her one day after work, and she's like, well, how are things going? And I said, well, do you know what my kids did today? My students did. And she said, well, mine did the same thing. And I thought, my gosh, the only difference between them in some respects is their size. The high school students and little elementary school students, and the ways that we react aren't that different. And then you know what happened? I was sitting in a faculty meeting, and I realized that, some of these things that we complain about our students doing, the adults were doing in a faculty meeting too. So there are certain things that we have a tendency not to outgrow, apparently. But we're not all that different. And I think Ralph has realized at the end possibly that, well, this adult who sees this as maybe an adventure, either he doesn't get the struggle of it, or he realizes that, oh, he's really not that different than we are, and they may have come to the same end. And that's what the author is suggesting, that the adults, it might have taken a lot more time, but probably would have gone down the same path that the boys did, unfortunately. Okay. Any other comments or questions about the end of the novel? Okay. You've got about 9 minutes left. You have the last four questions to answer it says the LOTF chapters 10 through 12 questions. You need to finish answering those and submit them. You also need to finish the character page. It was about, I think, well, let me pull it up and we'll see. Oops. Let me see. It was called Don't forget to do the themes and symbols. Several of you have that done. Character analysis. Okay. It was character analysis. It was worth 60 points, and you need to complete that now that we've finished the book. And then the last chapters You also had a writing task. If you haven't finished that, turn that in. And the questions for chapters 10 through 12. So there are several things we need to get done and turned in. Most of them are short. The longer one is the character analysis. And oh, I guess I had that due November 18th, but I'm going to change the due date on that to next week. At the time I set it in place, I wasn't sure when we would finish the novel. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. And if you don't have any questions, you are free